Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century. It is a project born out of my conviction that doing so requires an interdisciplinary and intersectional approach to understanding our complex world. I'm your host, Jaway Ayub, and in these episodes I bring you conversations at the intersection of politics, history, philosophy, culture, science, and all the fun stuff in between. The following episode was first published for monthly Patreon supporters. To become a monthly Patreon supporter, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes or check the website for other methods. You can become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. And if you cannot donate, you can still support this project by sharing with your friends and family and leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. The music of this podcast is by Tarabeat. Here's the episode. So it's become a common story, one told by the likes of celebrities and politicians, from Leonardo DiCaprio to Barack Obama. We've even often seen climate scientists tell it too, sometimes with added nuance and sometimes not. The story is that climate change caused the Syrian revolution in 2011. Usually, they refer to a drought that started in 2006, and which caused a large migration from rural areas to urban centers. The thing is, though, that this wasn't the first drought, nor necessarily the worst one. What changed was simply government policy, and of course the influence that the Arab Spring had on Syrian revolutionaries. In this episode I sat down with Professor Marwa Daoudy, author of the book The Origins of the Syrian Conflict, Climate Change and Human Security, to debunk some of these myths. We looked at the drought itself and how water and food politics in Syria, as indeed everywhere else in the world, have as much to do with politics and ideology than they have to do with the environment. We looked at the role of ideology, from rural Baathism in the 60s to neoliberalism under Al-Assad, to the so-called infitah or economic opening in 1990, and finally the social market economy since 2005 under Bashar Al-Assad. We spoke about the erasures that such deterministic narratives engage in. Who gets erased from the story and why? How does this tie into Western racism, xenophobia and Islamophobia towards the quote-unquote climate migrant or climate refugee? And why should the very idea of security be understood with more nuance? We even discussed the rural-urban divide in Syrian nationalist ideology. I think the questions we ask, as well as the answers provided by Marwa, are crucial to understanding ongoing debates that are sure to continue for decades to come as the effects of global warming worsen pre-existing structures and belief systems. So that's it from me, folks. Thank you for listening and take care.
I'm Marwa Daoudy. I'm an associate professor of international relations at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. I'm a political scientist with a focus on international relations, but also critical security, environmental politics, negotiation theory, mediation theory, and Middle East politics, of course.
So we'll be primarily talking about your book, The Origins of the Syrian Conflict, Climate Change and Human Security. As it was completely coincidental. I listened to a lot of podcasts and I was going on lots of my walks in the past couple of weeks, and two very, very different podcasts, very different themes, brought up the Syria and climate change in the same sentence. One, completely different. One was on ancient Greece, and they were making some pretty uncomfortable, very awkward comparison that didn't really work for me, and another one was on Star Trek, and they're also very random comparison. One, the Star Trek one, was a bit more nuanced, and the guest basically said it was part of the cause. He didn't say it was the cause. Whereas the other one was completely deterministic. Just said there was climate change, and then people it created anger, and people did revolution or whatever the argument was. And I feel like it was part of the kind of one of the underlying themes in the book while I was reading it, and as something to debunk or something to at least make a bit more complicated. So there's a quote that you use in the beginning by Garcia, which I will just read if that's okay. Climatic facts are not facts in themselves. They assume importance only in relation to the restructuring of the environment within different systems of production, end quote. So with all of that in mind, can we start with a general introduction of how did this topic come in mind, and how did you come to write the book, and what is it about, of course?
Yeah, of course. So actually, I've worked on environmental politics with a special focus on Syria since many years. My first book was on the Syria-Turkey-Iraq negotiations from a power asymmetry and security perspective, where I wanted to bring the perspective of the downstream countries, Syria and Iraq, over transboundary water sharing. So I did a lot of field work. I assessed what water meant for Syria, but also the security, international relations dimension, which is my focus as well. Having that experience, 10 years ago when the Syrian revolution happened, and I moved to the US a few years afterwards, I started reading a lot of the literature in environmental security by US scientists and European scientists who had never stepped a foot in Syria and who had never worked on Syria, who started making those connections, saying, actually, what is happening in Syria is a climate-induced conflict. So probably the intention was valid in the sense they wanted to bring awareness on climate change and create some sort of securitization to say climate change is important. It could create a tragedy like the Syrian tragedy. But for me, as a Syrian scholar and a scholar on Syria, that was very much of a shortcut. And it was very unfair, in my view, in terms of the plight, the involvement, the sacrifices made by the revolutionaries who did not have climate change at the forefront of their mobilization. And clearly, so I was actually working on another book. I was working on the peace process in Palestine, Israel, and trying to debunk this idea of a US mediation, external.
Yes, that's a big one,
yeah. So that will be maybe in my next project, but I switched the focus and I thought, no, I need to bring some agency here, bring the voice, because of course the Syrians were never asked about what is going on in terms of that narrative. And I thought I had the field experience. I could bring in the sources, I can bring in my perspective, also as a scholar, to debunk that narrative. Because the problem with that narrative, you mentioned determinism, clearly. So it's just, climate change. And we know that Thomas Friedman, between the usual suspects, always write about these shortcuts, thinking, well, there was drought, then that created conflict. Bashar al-Assad, in one of his first speeches in 2011, he blamed climate conflict for the grievances of the people. So I felt it was taking out the agency of the revolutionaries, but also of Syrian people and population. And this is when I started off this project, mainly with the idea of bringing their voices to the table and bringing my voice as well.
That's really great. And so that deterministic link, it's often, they usually reference a big drought that happened a few years before the start of the revolution. Can you sort of talk about that and why, so why are these deterministic interpretations, why are they wrong? Or why they're incomplete, let's say?
Yes, they like dramatic cases like the Syrian case, right? Because that's a good showcase to say, you see, it's dramatic. It created this major tragedy and crisis. So we should be writing and working on climate change. So actually, there was a very severe drought, which happened in Syria between 2006 and 2010. But it's not the first drought. Syria has a history of severe droughts, and people have always adapted, and they've managed. And if you take the drought per se, and also, of course, the narrative behind this climate conflict nexus is that there was a drought, that following that drought, all of the rural communities in the Hasakeh Jazeera province, formerly called Jazeera, they lost all of their livelihoods. They migrated, and they were the ones who were the source of instability and conflict in Syria. So somehow there's a dual aspect here. It's to say it's climate change, but also to put the responsibility of conflict and not thinking about what happened in Syria as a revolution, as an uprising, on the back of the migrants who actually were not part of the mobilizations. They had so much to deal with also because they were completely uprooted. They had no livelihood. They were parked in slums around Damascus, Daraa, different areas. And a lot of the interviews done by the activists I interviewed were telling me these were not the people. We know exactly who went to the streets of Daraa. These were the traditional families of Daraa, etc. So I needed to debunk that sort of deterministic approach, which again takes out also the responsibility of the government in that sense, because what happened is there was a very severe drought, but in my book, what I do, I compare the two droughts. There was one in 2006, but there was one in 98 to 2001. So the question here that one should ask, which I asked in my book, is why the 98, 2001, if we follow that narrative and that deterministic perspective, didn't lead to a conflict? Because we had actually a drought from the calculations I provide in the book, which was more severe than the 2006, 2010 in terms of decrease in rainfall, increase in temperatures, etc. So clearly we have to link it with the political economy of the management of the resources, of the scarce water resources, also of the subsidies which were removed from almost one day to another for these very vulnerable communities, and also the neoliberal reforms that were implemented in 2005 by the Bashar Al-Assad, a new presidency since 2000, where he really refocused his attention towards the urban centers versus the rural communities, creating, in fact, enforcing that rural-urban divide that we had witnessed also in the previous years.
Thanks a lot for that. And like a big part, you mentioned like the speech that Bashar al-Assad did in 2011. That's a good one. I actually forgot about that. Or the fact that a lot of those usually celebrities or even think tanks and politicians and others would kind of follow that same line of thought is a bit ironic. Because yeah, as you said, like, and it also, I guess it also links up to the other questions I had, which is like on the very concept of what it means by security. Like when we actually think of the word security, what does that mean? And I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I would really like to hear yours first on like, because I really see this book in many ways as trying to deconstruct a pretty prevalent notion of what security actually means, right?
Absolutely. So the think tanks you mentioned are the ones which, when I started reading these reports, really made me rethink my research agenda and really the need to really contribute to that conversation. So Leonardo DiCaprio's, film documentary was talking about Syria, and President Obama was interviewed talking about Syria being the civil war, not even the revolution, referring to the civil war as a climate-induced conflict, many think tanks publishing reports. And again, many people writing about it who had not taken sources from Syria, had not interviewed Syrians or even done research on that. There's another title, for example, when remember that little boy, Aylan, who was going from Syria to Turkey, and when he drowned, very tragically, 5-year-old boy, he was called an environmental migrant by a Canadian newspaper. This is what an environmental migrant looks like. So again, a lot of confusion, a lot of securitization, manipulation. Security, I think, for me, this is what I tried in my book is to say we should, because of course, what I mean by securitization is this was also part of a conversation in Europe where the migrants coming from Syria and Libya and other places following the Arab Spring were seen as security threats to European prosperity, stability, etc. So suddenly there was this new, very disturbing narrative, which was actually blaming the victims, right, of war, of repression, etc. So I felt there was a need to debunk this perspective, this security perspective, and this is where I link it to human security. And I think instead of looking at it from a state security perspective, we need to bring it down to the level of the human being and what did these communities experience, and later on also the vulnerability of these communities and their resilience is also very much dependent on the political context, the economic context, and they're not security threats, they're actually the victims, but they're also adaptive agents. And I debunk this also notion of migrants as either victims or threats. They're adaptive agents. We see a lot of these migrants coming and integrating in Europe, providing capital, as well as we've seen for a lot of the Syrian refugees who went to Jordan, Turkey, and Egypt. They contribute to the prosperity of these countries. So this is where I still use the security framework, but I debunk it by bringing the human security perspective.
In fact, like of all places, that ancient Greece podcast that I mentioned in the beginning had made also that exact same parallel. He was talking about like the sea peoples that were theorized to have basically destroyed the Bronze Age revolution, and then he made this huge jump, which, as I said, wasn't very convincing whatsoever. But by saying that, well, we don't know if the refugees of today, the climate refugees of today, will be like the sea peoples of the past, essentially saying that those are potential destructive agents. And I mean, the host didn't challenge him, which was an issue. But this is a pretty common through line in a lot of very different, I mentioned, as I said, two pretty random podcasts that have nothing to do with one another. I've heard this in context of, climate documentaries that have brought this up, narratives on social media. I've heard this, books that are, pop science books, let's put it that way, would bring it up almost, often meaning well, it's not necessarily not like that ancient Greece podcast person I mentioned, but often meaning well by saying like, if we don't pay attention, like if we don't, we're worried about 1 million. That was what the other one mentioned actually. We're worried about 1 million refugees that came, and look what it did to Europe. if we have 10 million or 100 million, and the United Nations estimates 1 billion climate refugees, etc., what does that mean? And it's always from that quote unquote security framework first. And I mean, as you said, it doesn't really cover much of the story.
And so there's also this, I totally agree with you, Joey, this narrative about collapsology, which is well-intentioned again, okay, but it has this doom and gloom aspect to it. And since the 90s, we had these, sort of forecasts about millions of refugees flooding again, in a north and south divide, right? We're talking about refugees coming from the global south and possibly impacting the security of the global north and its prosperity and its stability. And in Europe, we had quite of a sordid debate here. I mean, clearly, we saw what Hungary and other countries did in terms of concentration camps for these migrants coming from the Mediterranean region, and treating them as, in the words of the foreign minister, as security threats. They were coined as security threats. So we need to debunk that by showing also the different possibilities. I mean, these migrants come as, again, this term of adaptive agents. They integrate, they bring a lot of wealth in terms of knowledge, human capital, and also a financial capital for many of them. When they left Syria with know-how, and they brought, that contributed also to a lot of the know-how in Turkey we see today, which Syria is losing in the end.
Well, yeah, of course, I completely agree with this. And, to bring it back to Syria a bit more, because I can rant a lot about all of those other narratives and discourses. I have noticed, however, so let me ask it this way. I've noticed a lot of hesitation from Syrian friends. You yourself quoted Yassin Haj Saleh. He's going to be a guest on this podcast at some point in the near future.
I look forward to hearing that, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to be really good. And he also debunks this thesis, let's say, saying that those who resort to this climate change determinism, let's put it that way, are, quote, obviously ignorant of our situation and history, end quote. Now, I obviously agree with this, and I have no disagreements with that. I am, however, wondering, given that, we're rejecting the deterministic view, and we're seeing we need to focus on, also what the government response, the people's response, the actual, factors on the ground, in addition to the ongoing reality of climate change, which is almost definitely going to be, a multiplier or a stressor, whatever terms we want to use. How have you seen when the drought was brought up, or when climate change was brought up, maybe more broadly, let's say, how have people thought about it in Syria, if at all?
So you mentioned that quote that when I went to Istanbul 5 years ago, I met with Yassin Haj Saleh. And when I met him, I told him about my project, and he had no clue about this narrative. He was appalled, rightly so. And this is why I quoted him. He said they have no clue about our history, in the sense, understanding the history of the uprising, the revolution, and the reasons behind it, the rationale for the need for the population to mobilize and to uprise. I think there is a danger here, again, is the lack of accountability. When you focus on climate change as a reason for the so-called conflict, you take out the responsibility of the regime. You just think, like the same way as Bashar Al-Assad stated at the time, meaning, oh yes, of course there are grievances in the Rif, in the Hasaki region, in the breadbasket of Syria. People have been marginalized, but all of that is because of climate change. And we do our best to adapt to it. So he's not referring to the political protests that happened in 2011, the brutal incarceration of the young people and older people who went to the streets. So this is, again, negating the accountability, the responsibility of the elites. And that's why, in my analysis, I link the management of the drought with elite decisions made at the time that also contributed to the vulnerability of the population. And clearly, I also mentioned in my first chapter that the political repression and the Arab Spring were major triggers of the revolution. So we should not forget about the triggering factors. But what I was interested in looking more extensively into was the structural dimension about the political economy of Syria, the human insecurity in the decades that preceded the uprising and the revolution.
And a lot, we already mentioned this a bit, but to kind of, I guess, to emphasize it a bit more, a lot of the what we're calling like these deterministic, simplifications, these deterministic narratives, it's kind of the same thing as, a few months ago or a couple of months ago now, there was of course, the commemoration of the 10-year commemoration of the start of the revolution. But a lot of the headlines, a lot of the coverage, a lot of, those papers that I often criticize, said, 10 years since the beginning of the Syrian conflict, right? Like 10 years since the beginning of this, even they might say 10 years since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. Whereas March 2011 was not the beginning of the Syrian conflict or the civil war or whatever terms we want to use for later, was actually just the start of protest, the start of the revolution. What followed after. And it's a lot of that same narrative that I think has, sometimes through ignorance, sometimes ill-meaningly. I mean, Bashar is an obvious example, but lots of people who have invested interest in having this quote-unquote state security narrative, whereas they are in think tanks, including think tanks that would, call themselves anti-Bashar. I think that there are these convenient stories or convenient narratives, I should say, that keep on being recycled time and time again. But like a big part of this book, or at least, the impact it had on me, I haven't finished it, but I'm going through it, is this reaffirmation of just agencies of the people on the ground, the intellectuals who have been thinking about it, the activists, and so on and so forth. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Joey. And the thing is, what I wanted to do also is to show there's been a very, very rich and interesting debate happening in Syria in 2006 through the Syrian Association of Economic Sciences, engineers, water engineers, contributing to the discussion about climate change, the drought, and the mismanagement of the drought, but also the political economy choices that the regime was doing at the time. And they were warning the government, saying, be careful, this is making the populations more vulnerable, the issue of the subsidies, the issue of the corruption, etc. Some of these writers, by the way, have joined the opposition, circles later on, Samir Saifan and others, and they keep on writing about the corruption in Syria. It intensified the corruption, which was already there in the end. So I think this is very important to bring to the forefront also, that there's been a debate, which of course these think tanks never referred to, but I had a research assistant of mine go through all of the papers, summarize the main points, and I included it in my book to be able to show, in fact, the agency of these experts who are the most knowledgeable about what was happening in Syria. The second point I wanted to make, Joey, is talking about narrative. The regime also had a propaganda at the time. This urban-rural divide, from Idlib, all of these areas, speaking to the urban centers, because these were the privileged interlocutors for Bashar and the people around him, to tell them, beware, our way of life is being threatened. Of course, negating the political aspect of it. At the same time, what the regime security services were doing was also adding to the propaganda by saying, you see, Damascus and Aleppo were acquiescent because nobody rose, nobody joined the revolution, which was wrong, of course, because we know there were many protests, sit-ins, but the strategy of repression was much harsher in those urban centers, so that it pushed every public space. Every time there was a peaceful mobilization, it was very brutally crushed from the beginning, because there was a realization that Damascus and Aleppo were strategic for regime survival. And the result was that it pushed all of the mobilization to the outskirts of the city. And then it became, Rif Dimashq, the outskirts of Damascus, the outskirts of Aleppo, who became the heart of the opposition and the revolution. And again, contributing to this propaganda, saying it is a revolution of the dispossessed, and we should be preserving our urban, modern way of life. And again, in a lie, saying that these centers were quiet, when in fact they were not. They were heavily repressed as well.
Just so that I think just to be fair to sort of the argument that we're trying to disagree with, let's say, what did happen? Like, what did the drought do? Like, what did actually happen in the years before the revolution started?
So what happened is that you had a very severe drought. A decrease in the rainfall, increase in the temperature, and I'll refer you to the numbers there. But and again, what happened at the same time is that In 2005, the regime, the Ba'ath Party, met and decided to establish the social market economy, which was in fact to sort of liberalize the economy. In the end, it was getting inspiration from Germany's post-World War II recovery, remarkable economic recovery, thinking what we need to have is sort of some sort of safety nets from the government, but also liberalization. And actually what was happening at the time was that the regime was moving away from its rural constituencies and thinking also Syria had to withdraw from Lebanon, which used to provide very valuable rents for the army, the security service, etc. So by implementing these reforms, liberal reforms, the point was also to bring in more, revenues from external investments to Syria. International actors such as the World Bank, who was advocating the end of subsidies, and you know that Syria traditionally had a collective agricultural sector. Its, pan-Arab socialist ideology was really focused on bringing prosperity to the agricultural, the rural communities, making the peasant also the symbol of the new regime after the Ba'ath regime in the 1960s, the rise to power, and knowing also that Hafiz al-Assad was of a peasant family. So that was also sort of mixing legitimacy, power, under the encouragement of the World Bank, who advised that to have better reforms, economic reforms, the government should stop the subsidies. And we're talking about subsidies to, crops, paying like preferred prices, purchasing the crops, the so-called strategic crops, such as cotton, wheat, barley, and others. The strategic crops that have been favored by the Ba'athist governments throughout the decades that preceded actually 2005. And these are cotton, barley, wheat, which the peasants could sell to the government at favorable prices. Also, subsidies in terms of fuel, when the peasants needed to dig wells or to go and sell actually the crops, they had subsidized rates for the fuel. All of these subsidies were removed at the time quite drastically. And I mentioned before the papers written by Syrian experts, they were urging the government not to lift the subsidies immediately. They would arguing that eventually there would be the need to lift them to prevent further corruption. But in the context of the severe drought, that was in fact making the communities more vulnerable. What happened then was the collapse of the agricultural sector. And we're talking about the breadbasket of Syria in the northeast, the Jazeera province, the Hasakeh area. And usually these rural communities have always migrated, right? But it was a different type of migration. It was the head of the household who would go and migrate to other areas, possibly during the winter, come back and provide livelihoods to his family. In the case of 2006, 2008, the whole communities were uprooted. And the UN numbers were like 1 million. This is overrated. I looked back at the numbers in the papers. There were actually about 40 to 60,000 families, and that constituted about 400,000 individuals from that region who were completely uprooted and had to go to other areas in Syria, and they lost any means for survival when in fact they had traditionally relied on agriculture. And this is what happened at the time. When the government realized its mistake, it was too late. They tried to reinstall the subsidies in 2008 and 9, but then it was way too late because the whole communities had already migrated to other places in Syria, and they were neglected by local authorities. They were parked in slums. They were trying to survive and helped by a lot of the activists I talked to in Damascus who were telling me there was like private initiatives to go and provide for these communities. There was nothing done by the government at the time to help these uprooted communities.
And a lot of this, so you mentioned the reforms, the neoliberal reforms or whatever in 2005, when neoliberal reforms were actually before that. So yeah, so my next question was actually about that. You approached the topic of ideology in your book in terms of how it impacts food security. For example, it's kind of an obvious one, but feel free to think of others. I know you list the transition between rural Baathism in the 60s to neoliberalism in the 70s to the quote-unquote infitah, or like opening up the economy in the 90s, and then the social market economy in 2005. Can you sort of explain for those who don't know any of the words I just mentioned? What does that mean, and what does it actually look like in terms of at least food security, maybe if you want to focus on that, or water security for that matter?
Yes, so for me, ideology was an important factor, understanding the impact of what happened in Syria as human insecurity in the decades before 2011. What do I mean by ideology? I refer here to the Gramscian conception, encompassing also institutional practices, principles, and the dogmas also that consolidate the class alliances and a prevailing hegemonic discourse. And clearly, in the 1960s, with the rise to power of the Ba'ath, there was this idea of food security as a national security objective. And the idea was also to provide for the livelihoods of the peasants, to preserve the independence and sovereignty of Syria, and also this, burgeoning populations that needed to have the means for their livelihood. So food security became very, very important for the new classes. Also, the origins also, because of the origins, many of them are from peasant communities, so they wanted to provide back for their own communities. I contrast that with the liberalization, processes that didn't start in 2005, as you rightly mentioned. 2005 was the peak with the social market economy. But it's interesting to know the Infitah in 1990 was not, again, the first step under Hafiz al-Assad. It happened already in the 1970s when Hafiz al-Assad came to power. He realized that the government was not yielding sufficient revenues from agricultural sector, despite all of the investments. So he started liberalizing, decollectivizing, in fact, a lot of the sector and opening it to private investments, starting from the 1970s, and later also opening the economy to private investments. And actually, this food security objective, which had, I think, an honorable, intention behind it, led to a lot of the mismanagement of the water resources. There was intensive irrigation, intensive construction of illegal wells, which in fact tapped a lot groundwater resources, because it was cheaper for the peasants to just dig a very shallow well over 10 meters. It didn't cost much, and it allowed the peasant to irrigate its land. There was a core periphery within Syria divide between central authorities and engineers and the periphery, which did not want to always abide by these licenses and these demands for actually presenting authorization for a license to build a well. And the water security was quite impacted also by the construction of large dams, which create a lot of evapotranspiration. And we're talking about the Tabqa Dam on the Euphrates, which also led to societal issues such as the displacement of communities in the Euphrates basin, their settlement in the Hasakeh region, adding to the Kurdish issue within Syria, which is in fact with the plan of Arabization. So when we think about food security, water security, there's a whole set of different impacts and consequences which touch on economic, societal issues. Also, there was an ideological component to the choice of strategic crops that needed to be grown by the peasants. There was a very strict agenda here. And for example, a water engineer that I spoke to, he blames the revolution on the mistakes made in terms of developmental plans by the government by saying, for example, choosing cotton as a strategic crop was a huge mistake because it's highly water consumptive. So it added to the water scarcity issue.
And when you say they chose certain crops like cotton for ideological purposes, was it like because it appealed to a certain, they were appealing to a certain sense of like Syrian nationalism, for example, or something along those lines?
Yes, clearly there was the socialist, Ba'athist, pan-Arab, nationalistic agenda, which was important here, relying on the peasant. And I look through actually the cult of personality, but also the cult of the peasant as a way for the new regime, Ba'athist regime, to create legitimacy and to yield, to cater to these constituencies. The mistake that Bashar did afterwards was completely disregard these constituencies because his focus shifted towards the urban centers and new class alliances, actually, which Hafiz had started in the 70s when he also catered to the Sunni merchants. But what Bashar did was really the neoliberal higher class, the display of fortune, the display of money, which happened in Syria in the early 2000s and intensified this rural-urban divide between these urban centers, but also some classes within these urban centers and the periphery, which was completely marginalized in those plans.
Right, right. That makes sense. Okay, sort of kind of putting the academic hat on a bit more. A lot of discussions regarding what you call like the climate security nexus usually start from state security, as we said, like state security rhetoric, and I'm putting state security in quotations, which tends to criminalize potential climate refugees. Okay, we already went through this. I'll just re-emphasize this because it's just a massive concern of mine. I think it's something that's going to happen more and more as we were seeing it. We've been seeing it happening in the past few years, and I don't see this stopping anytime soon, unfortunately. And so what I mean by that is that a lot of concerns, as we said, regarding issues such as desertification, deforestation, water shortages, and so on, stem from politicians and governments and others being worried that the refugees fleeing these issues will come to them. The whole Fortress Europe metaphor in the case of the region and Europe. And I think part of what is happening is that they say that they don't want climate refugees. They say that they're worried about refugees and et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's one issue, an issue of xenophobia, an issue of nationalism, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, they continue to have these extractivist economies. They continue to have these pollution, which they themselves end up then saying, well, it's going to create climate refugees, et cetera, et cetera. So okay, this is like at the surface level. This is like at the level of discourses. What I'm interested in, like my question to you is more like, you think, okay, let me phrase it this way. You already said that this framework is, of course, simplistic, right? Like climate security nexus on its own is simplistic. What do you propose? Like, can you get into this HECS, as you call it, and can you kind of explain as to how this adds nuance in usually these debates that tend to be very oversimplistic?
So I was struck by the literature, and you mentioned rightly, it's the narrative, it's the discourse, but it's also how the discourse is built, the policy discourse is built through academic studies. So a lot of the literature in environmental security by geographers, political scientists, and others, they go through quantitative studies where they throw in this premise of a link with conflict, and the mitigating factor for them is, is there a sound institution or not? Is there migration again? How is migration contributing to that, etc.? So I think what I tried in my book is to move away from that and to say there's also a sample bias, because a lot of these studies look at sub-Saharan Africa where you already have a conflict. And then it happened that there's a drought. So you make those links saying, well, actually the drought is behind, the lack of cooperation, the conflict between the communities, etc. What I try with I developed a framework, a conceptual framework, which I called the Human Environmental Climate Security, HECS, where I bring in the human security aspect. And human security is a policy concept, which was developed by Amartya Sen and Habibul Haq to change the narrative in the 1990s, to say we should not think only in terms of Cold War, security, state level security. We need to look into the level of human communities, the individual communities as well. The problem with this concept, it also led to interventionist policies, like for human rights reasons, the US feels entitled to intervene, and to bomb, etc. What I wanted to do is to have a critical perspective on a human security level, so that I bring it to the climate security discussion as well, analyzing the interactions between human security, climate security, and also political and economic structures. So I felt the need to outline the unequal power structures that cause or encourage human suffering, with significant implications for climate insecurity and its consequences, and also for the unequal power relations between the global north and the south, which we don't have in those climate conflict discussions, but also between a central government and its marginalized subjects. And that is where the Syrian case study is very illuminating, in my view, in trying to debunk, but also to reinforce this idea of human insecurity, leading to instability more broadly, because the populations are marginalized and they have grievances. Although behind the Syrian revolution, we have to look into the different layers. And this is why actually I look into, I have concentric circles which overlap. So when you think about climate vulnerability, you need to look at the political vulnerability, you need to look at the economic vulnerability, issues of corruption as well, injustice, and the societal issues relating to migration and the dispossession of whole communities within that overall human insecurity.
Right, thanks for that. And you list three different factors, right, of the human, environmental, climate, security: structural, vulnerability, and resilience. Can you sort of just explain those a bit?
So, at the core of the climate change discussion, there are the issues of vulnerability and resilience, right? How does climate change make communities vulnerable, and are they resilient? Are they adaptive or not? Is there a possibility to enforce the adaptation? For
Right.
me,
Yeah.
I deploy these concepts. I put them at the core of my conceptual framework, but I link it to structure as well, which means for me, you cannot understand this if you don't look into the contextual factors that I've outlined previously, the political, economic, societal, and climatic vulnerability. So for me, vulnerability, I define it as the disruptions to patterns of daily life, from the perspective of the marginalized and the dispossessed, because I have this human security perspective. And these patterns include chronic water insecurity, land degradation, arable land scarcity, food insecurity, and poverty. And I think the issue of poverty is crucial here, because poverty is a result of the political economy of the policies, and climate change exacerbate that if it's mismanaged, of course. And in terms of resilience, it's also the capacity of these communities to anticipate, cope with, and recover and resist the impact of a natural hazard. So if you don't have the structures, the institutions, the government's involvement to help the communities resist and adapt and cope, which they have traditionally done, because drought is part of Syria's fabric, it's part of Syria's history, and they've done it in the past. But when you suddenly decide to implement neoliberal reforms because the World Bank and the international community is pushing you to do it, and it's part of your regime survival, then you're preventing these vulnerable communities from becoming resilient, and they actually lose all of their livelihood in the end.
Thanks for that as well. And is it okay if we can kind of get a bit more examples? Like you mentioned one thing that I think many people don't really know about, if they're not familiar with the specifics of Syrian dynamics, is you mentioned Arabization in the, I think you call it Arab encirclement of Kurdish areas. How does that relate to, like, why did you include that in the book? Let me put it that way.
Okay, I'll tell you why. Because when you grow up in Syria, for Syrians of non-Kurdish descent, the Kurdish Syrians in the urban centers are part of the whole population, and there's no distinction made there, and the families are mixed, etc. And I discovered the reality of what happened in the Jazeera province through a friend who's a Syrian Kurdish painter, who told me actually. When he was offering me one of his paintings, Bashar Al-Assad, he was telling me, actually, you have to realize that we feel we are part of the Arab culture, but we also have our own entity, and we have been denied citizenship for many decades by the Syrian government.
Yes.
So I was very struck when I started reading about the Tabqa Dam and the displacement of the population in the Euphrates Basin, who was promised, land elsewhere and resettlement, that there was an Arab encirclement plan here, a deliberate, strategic plan based on demographics, like to reverse the demographics in the Jazeera province. And one has to also contextualize the history of what happened in the Jazeera. These were initially Kurds who had fled Turkey, who were settled in the northeast of Syria, but they were never given the nationality, because the problem here was that in the perspective of the Ba'athist, Arab nationalist regime, was the need to Arabize these regions. And one way to do it was to resettle the population, the 60,000, but they were not all resettled, but the Arab population from the Euphrates Basin, bringing them to the Jazeera to try to reverse the demographic balance and to Arabize the region. And of course, part of the agrarian revolution that was supposed to help a lot of the rural communities, a lot of the Kurdish populations were denied access to the gains of that revolution and access to the land, etc. And that created resentment, clearly, on the part of the Syrian Kurds. And we know that somehow after the revolution, there was a tacit agreement between Bashar al-Assad's regime and these areas that they could go on their own, and they became autonomous, and they created the Rojava, just with the idea of putting pressure on Turkey, who had taken a strong stance against the Assad regime at the time.
Right, thanks. And this is really good, interesting example. Like, it's a pretty pretty direct and pretty concrete in many ways example of what you're calling the human environmental climate security, right? Can you think of another example of where the HEX, as you call it, the human environmental climate security framework, help us understand a dynamic within Syria that, without that framework, the narrative would simply be incomplete? Does that make sense?
I'm trying to think, because for me, the conceptual framework engulfs the whole links between climatic vulnerability, political, societal, and at the core, I look at water and food security. So are you thinking in terms of communities?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. In terms because you mentioned like dams, you mentioned irrigation. Those are, okay. So I guess I'm asking of like if we can maybe re-emphasize, if that makes sense, if that's not too much of a repetition, how ideology directly links, or how ideology directly ends up impacting people on the ground through these narratives, if that makes sense.
So clearly, ideology becomes sort of a driver of human insecurity, impacting water and food security. So this is why I think when you look at ideological choices, the preferences of the elites, again, we're talking about a top-down process. So you have elites who frame these ideological choices or these policies around ideological priorities, serving also their own interests somehow. It has a direct impact. It changes land tenure, access to land tenure. And we know there were politics of nationalization, which happened in the 1960s and 70s to redistribute the land to the different communities. The focus on food security also meant that these rural communities had to grow these strategic crops in priority. Otherwise, they would not benefit from the subsidies. That meant also the choices of crops, which were water intensive, were also ideologically driven. And I mentioned cotton before, and wheat as being the most important strategic crops for Syria. The distribution of land, the fact that you had also the collectivization of agriculture, where people had access to entitlements through these collective, structures, also meant that some categories within these populations were favored at the expense of others. And this is where corruption also happened through that. And the irony is that the lifting of subsidies was on the ground of, preventing further corruption. And we know for sure that, for example, a lot of the people in the different regions would sell subsidized fuel to Lebanon and other parts because they bought it very cheap and they were able to sell it at the higher price in the neighboring countries. So that created corruption. But at the same time, possibly there was also corruption at the different levels of the government, entrenched in the political economy and the management of natural resources, which was even more emphasized when you look at the water and food production, access to water resources, management of water resources through the dams and irrigation networks, but also the political objective of reaching food security at any expense, even though it really impacted groundwater, even though you had different populations accessing food security or not, having privileged access to the collectivities, which I outline. Hanna Batato has really written beautiful books about the organization of the agriculture sector according to these ideological preferences, and which parts of the elites actually and the different classes were privileged in the process, allowing us to understand actually how these different concentric circles that I outline overlap in understanding why we need to look at the drought, why we need to look at climate change from this social, political, economic, and societal perspective as well.
Actually, it made me think. Like I had written this essay or this paper with Christophe Maroun, a friend of mine, last year for the Arab Reform Initiative, on the Bisri Dam in Lebanon, and of course opposing it. And we kind of went through the history, and turned out that the project, the idea of it, went back to the 50s. It was proposed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. After at the time there was a very pro-U.S. Lebanese government, of course. And it turns out, this is something I didn't really know, that governments like the Lebanese one really loved dams. Like they really loved to use dams at almost every turn. One academic, Namat Abu Sham, environmentalist, described dams as having this almost idealized place in Lebanon's national water strategy. Is there something similar along those lines? You mentioned how the World Bank really also, or you mentioned how the government was basically falling in line with what the World Bank's quote unquote recommendations were, right?
Yes, they recommended to lift the subsidies to allow for
Yes,
foreign
yes.
investments and to allow for more flexibility and not to focus so much on the agricultural sector. Then the World Bank claimed afterwards that they recommended that the government does it gradually and takes into account the climatic context. Of course, we never know how much of that is true or not, but at the time, clearly that call was answered by the Bashar al-Assad government. I think this mythology around dams is not particular to Syria and Lebanon. It's also very much part of a lot of the developmental plans from the
Yes,
1960s,
yes.
70s, 80s. This idea of taming the river and taming the man taming the river and producing benefits such as hydroelectricity, irrigation to increase food production, feeding the burgeoning populations. And we're talking about post-independence countries with an ideal of sovereignty, independence, nationalism. The problem here is the fact of building large dams. And there's also this issue of the power of the engineer. And by the way, Turkey has built a huge, one of the biggest dams in the world, the Ataturk Dam. And it's part of the same narrative, yes, which is contested by a lot of environmentalists because you create a lot of, you lose evaporation. Like when you have such large reservoirs, there is a lot of evaporation, so water is wasted. You also displace populations because you need to flood many areas. And Turkey has also flooded large part of Southeast Anatolia, where a lot of the Kurdish population is, and a lot of the, yes, Kurdish military movements reside as well. So there's a political, engineering, technical dimension to it, which is very interesting. In the case of Syria, the Tabqa Dam was seen as a major symbol of this new Ba'athist regime. It was built in 1973, finished in 1973, and it created this narrative that the government was bringing electricity to the remotest areas of Syria. It was modernizing the country. And I'll refer you, I don't know, for those of you who know popular Syrian culture, there's Ka'sak Ya Watan, Cheers to My Nation by Dored Laham. And there's an excerpt I showed my students a while back where he's being tortured by the security services, right? And the torture in Syria traditionally and until today is through electricity. And he claims at some point, says, wonderful, electricity has reached my behind before reaching my village. And there clearly it's about the failure of these plans, right? Like saying my government being so effective in using electricity when actually the populations do not reap the benefits necessarily. And I think behind these plans, there's a lot of dreams, but also failures. And the Tabqa Dam, interestingly, was also a target when Daesh, ISIS, started, its military operations in Syria. Capturing the dam was also a symbol of power and success. And they captured the Tabqa and the Tishreen dams for a while before they lost it. And they entered into agreement with the regime in terms of the provision of the electricity. So again, dams have a very symbolic importance in terms of these developmental, but also in projecting power for any entity, state or non-state actor.
Like if it's okay, I'm gonna put my cultural studies hat on a bit.
Of course.
So of course, it's gonna sound weird at first, but I urge listeners to be a bit more patient with me here. So of course, when the Avengers movie, right, there was this character of Thanos, and the entire plot of that character was, he wants to kill half of all living beings because he is worried about overpopulation. And this is, according to my interpretation and a number of other people that I can name, I'm probably going to do an episode on this at some point, reflects quite a common, let's say, anxiety would be the optimistic view of it, but often it kind of also veers into eco-fascism or racism or, other stuff, because of course, when people think of populations, when people have these concerns, quote unquote, they tend to focus, of course, on the global south, which has actually a pretty disproportionate impact on climate change, or reverse disproportionate, in the sense they actually contribute much less than the developed world, which has fewer people. But putting that aside, the link here is that to go back to kind of the beginning of our conversation, The whole, I mentioned that ancient Greece podcast of, mentioning the refugees as climate refugees and as essentially harbingers of doom, potential ticking bombs, as that a very racist Charlie Hebdo headline on Aylan Kurdi was a couple of years ago now. The link here that I was trying to make is that the people who end up having these very deterministic interpretation of climate change and security, or that climate security nexus that you mentioned, actually have quite a lot in common with the people who will then be obsessed with population or quote unquote overpopulation, be obsessed with quote unquote climate refugees, having, so the link is actually might be awkward at first when you think about, oh, well, Thanos' character and everything. But I think that represents pretty common interpretation of our world. I can actually list another one. I think I already mentioned this on this podcast. I was taking this environmental course in Beirut around the time of the revolution and the end of 2019. And the topic was actually on permaculture in Lebanon. So it had nothing to do with population, and there was no real hint by the professor that this is where we're going to go. But at some point, one of the students in the class immediately started talking about overpopulation in Africa. Mm-hmm. And this is something that, we debunked it, we deconstructed it, we even, like, I got a bit, I got a bit angry. But when we started talking, more calmly, I realized that this is something that a lot of people have in the back of their mind when they think about these things. And that's why, because they would have this emotional response immediately, right? They would think of people, foreigners flooding our lands, using that metaphor, which is ironic given what flooding, in the context of climate change. But so does that make sense? I don't know if I feel like I ramble too much. I'm sorry.
No, I think it's an excellent point, Joey, because that's exactly what I touch on in the beginning of my book when I mentioned deterministic narratives and perspectives. If you look at the climate conflict, the climate nexus narrative, you have to, and I do it in the first chapter, you have to put it in context with the water wars narrative of the 1990s,
right?
Which
yes.
At the time, and again, in a mix of popular culture, movies, documentaries, influencing policy, academic papers influencing the policy, and vice versa, etc. So at the time, there were these claims that the next wars would be water wars, and actually why? What was the understanding behind it? It would be to say, well, because the water resources are becoming scarce, there will be disputes over these scarce resources, and because of overpopulation, again, there was a neo-Malthusian aspect to it also, saying the pressure by population growth, of course, in the global south, we're not talking about the global north, but population growth in the global south will lead to more scarcity and potentially to war in the global south, having an impact on the global north. And this neo-Malthusian aspect has really influenced, for example, people who advised the Clinton administration, Al Gore and others at the time, and push them to condition foreign aid with limitation of population growth, like with programs saying, well, we give you aid if you agree to limiting population growth in your country, and we're talking about the global south. Interestingly, with the climate conflict nexus, like 20, 30 years later, we still have this population aspect through migration, but now we're talking about human mobility, right? Population being mobile and migrating and moving, and potentially, again, also impacting the security, the prosperity of these Western or global North countries. So you do have a neo-Malthusian perspective in it, which is clearly deterministic and racist in the end, because we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking about Mediterranean, we're talking about non-Western populations possibly threatening and invading and flooding the societies in the global north. And this is why one has to debunk it. And it's also emphasized, you mentioned the movie, there's been like a lot of documentaries, and at the time taken up by policymakers, but also academic studies a lot, which have contributed to that. And I think it's a very important point. I agree with you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, it's something that I'm just pretty concerned by. It's I do watch a lot of nature documentaries, and there's always, or not always, but a lot of the time there is these, this either undertone or even overtone of like, either we do something about quote unquote the population, or the rest is almost like there's a very linear way of thinking, like more people means more pollution means more, etc., etc. And this just doesn't take into account any of the actual realities of the world we live in, doesn't take into account capitalism, doesn't take into account power dynamics, power imbalances, north, south, etc., etc. So thanks a lot for that.
And it doesn't question the behavior of the, for example, if you think you're worried about, climate change, you should maybe change your way of life and use of fossil fuels. It's much easier to go and say, well, these potentially vulnerable, marginalized, scary populations that want to come and steal our way of life and want to live with us and invade us are the ones to address and to target, versus we need to change our way of life and capitalistic modes of production and the use of fossil fuels, and knowing that the US is one of the major polluters internationally. But then again, you shift the focus and you sort of securitize again the discussion and the debate. And that's why I think we need to debunk that and desecuritize it.
Yes, thanks. There's really, for me, there's a direct line between everything we're talking about to, I mentioned this a number of times as well, but like the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, describing the Greek Coast Guard's actions against migrants and refugees as Greece being the shield of Europe, aspida, she used the Greek term for it. Yes. There is very much, and while obviously Europe continues these extractivist economies, continues its polluting economies, there is very much this, like, we can, just build a wall essentially, to use that Trumpist narrative. But I mean, Europe has been doing the same thing for a few years now as well. And in order for us to have freedom of movement within Europe, I'm based in Switzerland, then we need to have these walls outside of Europe to protect us from basically the inevitable consequences of our own actions. Or at least that's how it's being portrayed, when it is being portrayed a bit more honestly than the usual discourses.
Exactly. And you notice, Joey, the militarization of the discourse, which is also part of the securitization, right? Europe being a fortress, the shield, security threats, etc. It's a way of addressing these human tragedies in military terms, so that you can target them with military operations or military-like measures. So it's very interesting again to see how language, the construction and the production of knowledge, also frames what is perceived as a security threat. And who is perceived as a security threat.
And I mean, I think the two of us are particularly well placed to understand the risks and the dangers of what happens when everything is militarized, especially language.
Absolutely.
And you actually have an entire section as well in the book. I opened it now, like from semantics to policy over migration. So you do also place quite a lot of emphasis on the very language used, like the politics of language used to describe these things, right?
I think it's crucial, because when you look back at, all this literature on securitization, is how, from a Foucauldian perspective, how you shape perspectives through language, you construct, sort of concepts and ideas through language. And you see an evolution in terms of semantics. And we see it in terms of climate change also. This idea of climate security is also a constructed idea, and it is impacting policymakers, because it's easy, it's attractive, you can put budgets on it, you can identify a threat, etc. We've seen it in Syria also, the move from revolution to civil war or to conflict, denying the agency of the uprisings, of the revolutionaries. So I'm very concerned by these semantics, the battle, the struggle behind the words, and how they are easily manipulated, manufactured, and translated into policies, because you are able to shape perceptions. And I think that's why, as to go back to your initial question, this notion of security, we should not take it as granted as being, just what is meant by those policymakers. We can shape what we mean by security. And this is why I think human security, from a critical perspective, still putting it in the context of, unequal structures, which at the time human security did not do, questioning the power asymmetry, the modes of production, etc., in my view, provides a useful lens to debunk all of this, jargon and narrative.
Right. Yeah, no, totally. Thanks a lot for that. And I mean, so I want to get into the book section, but before we do that, is there anything that you wanted to get into that I didn't really ask?
No, I just want to say that this really, for me, the purpose and the motivation of writing this book was really to put Syria and the Syrian revolution and what happened in Syria on the map. and not let, for example, others shape what it means, what the Syrian revolution meant, what happened in Syria, and also to show the agency of Syrians. And I've met refugees, I've met experts, I've met activists, and I wanted their voices to be heard, also within that debate, which often disregards, that level of understanding and analysis, and does not give agency to the vulnerable, to the activist. It was giving agency to the policymakers, etc. So this was a major concern for me. And I wanted also the Syrian experts who I interviewed, who have been working on these issues for many, many years, who of course are heartbroken about what is happening in the country, to contribute to the discussion. And I hope I've been able to do that through my research.
No, absolutely. I honestly highly recommend this book.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. And I mean, speaking of books, what are your 3+ books that you would recommend, and why?
So it's hard, of course, to limit it to 3 books, but I will mention the books that impacted me as a teenager and as a young adult growing up. And then more recently, the books that impacted my research and also my concerns as a Syrian and as a scholar of Syria as well. So as a young teenager, I was very impressed by and very marked by Hermann Hesse Steppenwolf. For me, it was about the human condition, the loneliness of the writer within a society, and the loneliness of anyone pursuing intellectual endeavors which do not fit mainstream norms and conventions. And it made me think a lot about what missions we have in life. The other book that marked me also as a teenager was Jack London's Martin Eden, and it was the destiny of a young working class man struggling to become a writer, getting out of his class condition, a free spirit who in the end is crushed by loneliness when navigating society's norms again. So that was part of my reflection as a teenager at the time. And more recently, I will mention 3 books on Syria, which really marked me and continue to mark me. So the first one is Samar Yazbek, The Crossing. It's part of all of her writings, and when she writes in the book that the only victor in Syria is death, and she dedicates her books to the martyrs of the revolution, the betrayed, and I think that captures it all. Yassin al-Haj Saleh's Impossible Revolution, where he goes through the drivers, the triggers. His personal testimony is very powerful also, as someone who has been detained for so many years in Syria's prisons, and also as one of Syria's major intellectuals. I would put here also his letters to his disappeared wife, Samira al-Khalil, who was abducted in Douma in 2013. Douma, ironically, where Bashar al-Assad casted his vote in the last so-called elections in Syria, as a symbol of domination and repression again. And I will end with Mustafa Khalifa's The Shell al-Kawka'a, which I was very moved to read. The tale of a prisoner in Syria's prisons. Very terrifying, but also extremely moving and very telling, a lucid and chilling account of what it means to be a detainee, to experience torture, but also solidarity in the prison cell, and a message of hope, possibly for all Syrian detainees. I'm saying possibly and hopefully.
All right, thanks a lot for that. As I said, I will have Yassin on at some point in the near future.
Wonderful.
And I will say also that Sarah Hunaidi, a good friend of mine, has been translating Samira's letters from Arabic into English.
Oh, wonderful.
I don't actually know when
very
that's going to be
moving, very
published.
touching letters, yes.
They are. And if anyone's listening, if you want to read Samira's letters, you can find them on Jumhuri. I will link those in the description. Terry, Marwa, thanks a lot for your time. This has really been a pretty enriching conversation.
Thank you so much, Joey. I really enjoyed it. And I told you at the beginning, when you sent me sort of a sketch of the type of conversation we would have, you put me on my toes. And I appreciate it. And also, questioning the security framework, all of that, and very enlightened and interesting questions. And I thank you very much for your time and for giving me this opportunity to really dwell and explain a project which is very dear to my heart and to my research agenda as well.
My pleasure, really. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.
The Fire These Times is made possible by supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support through a monthly donation, you can head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes. And if you want to explore other options, you can do so by checking out the website.